On July 4th, 1776, as we all learned in school, the representatives of the 13 states, after nearly a year of meeting and discussing how to handle the crisis with the British government, finally signed the Declaration of Independence. All states, except for New York, would assign an affirmation of seceding from the British Empire. New York, of course, would abstain, as the British Navy, the largest navy at the time in the world, was sitting right outside their harbor. Hi, I'm Lucas Kagi. I am the history chair and a history, government, and economics teacher at Providence Classical Christian Academy in Rogers, Arkansas. And this is the long history of the American Revolution. See, to understand the American Revolution, which actually really wasn't a revolution, and you'll see why I say that as we proceed, because it was a conservative revolution, which is actually a bit of an oxymoron, given that conservatism, without all the different current contextual points tied to it, just means to conserve the way things are. Revolution, on the other hand, is to throw off and to change everything. See, the French Revolution was a revolution. The American Revolution was not really a revolution. It was a rebellion, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't really a revolution. So let me get into that. See, let's go way back. Let's go back to even the Saxons. You have Saxons coming into England early on in what we call the Dark Ages. Even some of these Germanic Saxon communities had traditions of local self-government. That would, of course, trickle down through British history. You get all the way up to 1215. You've got King John IV, notorious as the King John of Robin Hood legends, who wants to wage war and wants to raise taxes and wants to do what he wants to do as the monarch by his own authority. And a lot of the lords and nobles of England basically say absolutely not. King John IV, if you're going to retain your kingship and not go to war with your own nobles, you must sign this document called the Great Charter, as we all know, the Magna Carta, which did set certain limitations on the king. He couldn't raise taxes without the nobles' consent. These nobles and their representatives would later on become known as the British Parliament. Over time, they would control, have more and more control or less control at various times over the king. And we will see them, of course, ultimately become the core of the British government. So let's jump ahead now to when that's starting to happen, the 1600s. And yes, all of this does have to do with the American Revolution, if you really want to understand why this is a conservative revolution. See, the Stuart family takes the throne of England in 1603 with James I. Of course, he wasn't James I of Scotland. I believe he was James IV of Scotland, but nevertheless, he's going to be James I of England. And he will try to rule based on this idea of divine right, which says that by virtue of my status as king, I have the divine right to rule. I am above the law. What I say is the law because I have been positioned here by God, and whatever I do is as the authority of God. Well, Parliament didn't like this too much. They would put up some resistance, and ultimately in 1628, they would force him to sign the Petition of Right, limiting some of his powers. But for the most part, there was not a whole lot of pushback against James I. His son, Charles I, would take the throne and try to take this even further, even dissolving Parliament for over a decade. He basically told them, go home, and I am going to run this country on my own. Now, remember, back to the Magna Carta, it was the tradition that Parliament had control over taxation, which means guess what? If Charles I wants to go to war, which he did, he's got to raise money for the war. Well, guess who he has to get the money from? Yep, Parliament. So he goes to Parliament, and they refuse to give him the money that he wishes. And so he disbands them and says, all right, fine, I will raise money my own way. And he goes back to old laws saying, hey, if you hunt on this land that belongs to the king, then I can tax you for that hunting. He goes back to laws that said he could tax certain port cities, and then he even taxed internal cities not on the coast of England with the same law. A lot of people are really upset. A lot of people are calling out for, hey, this guy is just going back and basically scraping the bottom of the barrel to violate our liberties as British citizens, to raise money for wars that he has not been basically authorized by the financing of Parliament to do. And so Parliament will come back into session when he's finally at the end of his rope. He can't raise enough money. Okay, he calls Parliament back into session, and they immediately say, "You must follow our authority." And he tries to disband them again. Long story short, England will end up in a civil war between the Parliament and the people who support the Parliament, and the King and the people who support the King. This is the English Civil War of 1642 to 1649. It will end with a parliamentary victory, and King Charles I will be put on trial and subsequently executed. England will go through about a decade under a Puritan, actually, by the name of Oliver Cromwell, who was essentially a military dictator. Stories of his atrocities in Ireland, of course, still haunt the Irish today. He would try to implement a lot of moral reforms, but he also ruled with a relatively heavy hand in a lot of different areas. His military controlled the country for the majority of that decade. And then when he dies, the English are going to want a king again. They're kind of tired with this military dictatorship situation. Even though Oliver Cromwell calls himself Lord Protector, they want the monarch to come back, so they go ahead and tell Charles II, son of the executed Charles I, who's been living in exile in France for a while, hey, we want you to come back to the throne. Charles II agrees, of course, comes back. He does try to rule on divine right, more or less, but for the majority of his very long reign, until 1685, there are no major wars. Now, he does do things that give them concern, and ultimately Parliament does debate, and there's a faction of Parliament that become known as the Whigs, who really are nervous about Charles II, and then especially they're nervous about when Charles dies, and his brother James II will inherit the throne. They're really worried about James II, and ultimately Charles II does die. James II does take the throne. For a while, the Whig Parliament members, who are again concerned about, the king trying to assert divine right authority, they kind of think, all right, hold off. When James II dies, his daughter Mary, who is a Protestant, and that was another conflict here. James was Catholic. Of course, England had tried to expel Catholics. The Catholics were under a lot of persecution in England. And so they thought, okay, Mary is a Protestant. When James II dies, Mary will be able to become queen, and then Parliament again will have a Protestant queen, and she'll be, in theory, subservient to the throne. Well, James II's wife gets pregnant, and she has a boy, and the Whigs of Parliament say, enough. That is enough. They invite Mary over her dad's head, over James II's head. They invite her and her Dutch husband, William of Orange, to come up and be the monarchs of England on the condition that they sign the English Bill of Rights. William and Mary return to England. James II slips out of England. There's very little conflict. There's a few skirmishes, a few fights, but for the most part, this is what historians have now called the peaceful or the glorious revolution. James II leaves, William and Mary come in, they sign the English Bill of Rights, which limits their power and establishes parliamentary authority. That's 1688. Of course, we know the American Revolution did not begin until 1776. There's a lot of details in here, but what I'm trying to show you is that there is a background here of conflict that helps us to understand the context of the American Revolution. So now let's jump over to the colonies. Of course, you have Virginia as the first one, founded 1607, which would be back in the days of James I. Okay, the last one would be Georgia, established about 1733. That would be the last of the 13 original colonies to be established, and all the others came in between. The purpose of this video is not to cover the background of all those different colonies. In the late 1600s, in fact, under Parliament, there had been a series of laws passed called the Navigation Acts. These were based on mercantile economic theory, which I'm not going to get into right now. The essential idea being that the wealth in the world is limited, and the empire that's going to be the strongest, most powerful, needs to try to draw in as much of that wealth and as much of the natural resources that are in the colonial territories as possible. And so England implements a number of these navigation laws, which limits colonial trade with other countries. For example, it's good that they disincentivize trading with France or Holland with high taxes. Certain percentage of the crews on merchant ships have to be British. They have to go through British ports eventually. They have to pay certain taxes if they're going to trade with other countries, that sort of thing. And these laws are on the books pretty much from the late 1600s all the way to the American Revolution. The thing is, there's a bit of corruption. A lot of the officials in the colonies who are supposed to enforce these laws are bribed. They're paid off. They may not care all that much. The colonists basically evade the laws for a very long time, for decades, until the French and Indian War, which is really one of the first world wars. It's a European-wide war involving the colonies. All European major powers get involved, including the British, who will face off against the French in the colonies. And so they're fighting a war against the French in North America. At the same time, they're financing Prussia, okay, and King Frederick in Prussia, who's also fighting the Austrians and the French. And so they're spending money in North America to fight there. They're helping to finance the Prussians in what would become Germany later on. And so this is a very expensive war. Now, traditionally in British history, the only people who were consistently taxed over time were your really wealthy landholders, at least at the parliamentary level. These were the people who paid taxes on their land, and that's where Parliament would get most of their financing. And then when England went to war, they would raise taxes on everybody to pay for the war, wartime financing. And then when the war was over, they would decrease taxes, and most of your average British citizen did not pay taxes except during wartime. Now, granted, England had been through a lot of wars, but traditionally, again, after the war ended, those taxes would basically drop off for most people and return to the standard situation where only the really wealthy landholders paid taxes, which, by the way, is why the really wealthy and large landholders typically were the ones who voted for parliamentary in parliamentary elections, but chose their parliamentary representatives, because they were the ones who were affected by parliamentary policy, whereas the average British person, at least not directly, was affected by parliament policy. After the French and Indian War, things are different. The British government is so much in debt that they are not able to lower taxes back to regular peacetime levels. They have a lot of debt they have to finance, and they're scrambling for, okay, how do we pay off these debts? The British people are used to the taxes coming back down. We can't do that. There's civil unrest at home because they're upset about these high taxes. So they think, hey, why don't we just shift some of the tax burdens to the colonies? After all, the British were successful in the war. The French were kicked out of North America, and that, in theory, will allow the colonists more room to expand in North America into what had been French claimed territory. So we were doing this for their protection. The French were a factor limiting their expansion. And so we're doing this for the colonists. Why don't they help pay for it? So they begin to enforce some of these early acts, the Navigation Act, to try to raise taxes. Now, it is ironic because the British would then turn around after an Indian uprising called Pontiac's Uprising or Pontiac's Rebellion. The British would ultimately tell the colonists, all right, actually, you know what? You can't really move across the Appalachian Mountains. But that's kind of beside the point. These taxes are going to be in place. And there's a series of taxes. I'm not going to go through all of them. They're going to start with the Sugar Act, which is going to try to raise revenue from various imports of sugar, molasses, and other related goods. They'll be followed by the Stamp Act. This is going to be the most controversial of the early taxes because unlike the Sugar Act, which was controversial in and of itself, the Stamp Act was a tax, an internal tax on just everyday goods. And this really is where we need to get into the heart of the crisis. Now, one other point to mention. When the colonists start to try to evade these taxes, just like they had other taxes in the past, the British basically issue a law called the Writs of Assistance, which allows British officials to go search colonists' home for contraband, things that they had purchased illegally without having paid the tax on it. You'll have James Otis in the year 1761, right around the time when a lot of these laws are getting passed. Now, the Stamp Act actually wouldn't be passed until 1765. But James Otis is going to come along and say, look, This is an example of legal positivism. Well, what is legal positivism? This is an important point to make. Legal positivism is the theory that the lawmaker is the source of the authority of their law. It is, in other words, what I say goes because I am the sovereign here. I am the person with the last say. It's basically a rejection of negativism, which says, you know what, our rights are inherent to us because they're given by God. Okay? Positivism says, no, actually, what we say goes. And if we give you rights, then you have rights. If we don't give you rights, then you don't have rights. And so basically, James Otis is saying this is, and he's a columnist, this is unacceptable because traditionally we have recognized as British citizens that we have essential rights, and in you invading our homes, our space, this is a violation of that tradition. So back to the American Revolution. What was this all about? What this was really about was whether or not the British government had a right to improvise and try new things and expand their reach of power beyond what was traditionally held. See, there was a British Constitution. It wasn't written. There were written parts of it, the Magna Carta, the Petition of Right, the English Bill of Rights, various other elements that would play into the British Constitution. But really, it was all this and a collection of traditions that said, you know what, there are certain rights that the people have, and there are certain rights that the Parliament has, and there are certain rights that the King has. And it was traditional. One of the key traditions was that the colonists had the right of self-government, and particularly of being able to tax themselves. And this is kind of the crux of the issue, is that they believed taxation to them was absolutely appropriate so long as it was done by their elected representatives. Therefore, it was not in the purview, in the jurisdiction of the Parliament to issue taxes on the colonists, and hence the cry we're all familiar with, no taxation without representation. And so as the British tried to enforce more and more taxes between about 1764 and 1776, the colonists are going to be resisting the improvisation of the Parliament, saying, look, this is outside the British Constitution. You're violating our traditional constitutional rights. Incidentally, Parliament, trying to play a kind of a delicate balancing act, would rescind a lot of these taxes, but then at the same time issue things like the Declaratory Act, which said, all right, well, we're going to let you off the hook for these taxes, but we retain the right to tax you, and I quote, in all cases whatsoever. Well, of course, that's kind of like saying, all right, we're going to bend over to what you say, but we're still the sovereign here, especially in the issue of taxation. Ultimately, that is what's going to lead to the crisis and the series of meetings between representatives of the colonies discussing whether or not the colonies would be independent. And that is the contextual history of the American Revolution. So in wrapping this up, let me just draw a few final connections and concluding points. See, in 1688, it had been the Whig faction of Parliament that had pushed for kicking James II out of England and bringing in William and Mary, and pushing for the signing of the English Bill of Rights. The American revolutionaries of all different varieties, between John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and a great host of other names, many you've heard, many you haven't heard, they had a lot of different opinions on politics and how government should be structured. But generally, they saw themselves, and they were in agreement on this point, as the inheritors of the Whigs of the Glorious Revolution. See, the Whigs in 1688 had said there are certain traditions in the English governmental system that says the Parliament has the right to tax those who choose its members. The Parliament has the right to raise taxes and finance what the king wants to do. The parliament has certain rights. And that tradition in 1688 was being protected by the Whig Party. And so in 1776, the revolutionaries see themselves as these traditional Whigs seeking to protect their traditional rights, where Parliament this time had overstepped its bounds. Interesting final point, because if you've read the Declaration of Independence, you know that the accusation actually isn't really at Parliament, it's at the king. Why is that? Incidentally, King George III was the third of the Hanover line of kings. He was the first to speak English. See, the Hanovers were from Germany. There had been a series of situations after William and Mary where that England was left without a monarch. When Mary died, her sister ruled for a while, and then there was another situation where they didn't know who was going to be king, so they invited a distant relative over, George I from Germany. He didn't speak English. His son didn't speak English, and George III actually was the first German Hanover king to speak English. And traditionally, again, in the Whig mindset, the king was the protector of British liberties, and should be resisting Parliament in this case, because Parliament was the one violating what they believed was the British Constitution. And so when King George III aligns himself with Parliament, they see him then ultimately as violating his responsibility. And it's also easier, of course, to find a single scapegoat. One final point before we're done. I might say that several more times before we're actually done. Okay, there were British politicians, namely Whigs in Parliament, which was basically a political party in the British Parliament, who were not altogether opposed to the American proposition that their rights were being violated. Namely, Edmund Burke, a political theorizer and a politician in the House of Commons for a while. I believe he was in the House of Lords as well. Looked at the American Revolution and said, no, they have legitimate concerns here, and Parliament is violating those rights. The Whigs were a minority at the time in Parliament, for the most part, and ultimately could not stave off the coming revolution. So that, in conclusion, is, again, the contextual history of the American Revolution.